So in the last video, I announced that I've signed up for the Étape de Tour and also the Mont Ventoux Gran Fondo. Both of these events are going to require a lot of good durability and fatigue resistance, and that's something that I will have to train for. I signed up to the Étape de Tour in 2025, and I'm going to try and be really competitive and finish in the top 10. Now I also have the Gran Fondo Mont Ventoux between now and then to test the waters. Now the idea with both of these events is obviously to improve my durability and my fatigue resistance. It's become quite a trendy topic amongst cyclists and coaches and social media as well over the last couple of years. And for good reason, because we see more and more numbers, data, whatever you want to call it, from the pro riders, and it always brings about the conversation about the difference between an amateur cyclist or even a pro tour cyclist and a world tour or Tour de France winning cyclist. Now, fellow racer Dylan Johnson has made a cracking video recently on why FTP doesn't matter. This does. And there's a couple of points that I want to kind of highlight from that video that I will probably no doubt mention more and more as we get into this video series where I'm going to be covering my training and preparation ahead of these big events. So a great quote from Dylan's video is along the lines of like, a race isn't won on fresh legs, it's won at the end on tired legs. And that really strikes a chord with me because of my racing background and the exploits and the challenges and races that I do now. With all the hill climbing races that I've done and say Cyclists, for example, my fresh power is what I lean on the most. And I go through phases of training, doing lots of mileage, doing lots of hours, and then also going through periods where I'm doing lots of intensity. It's only when an event crops up on the calendar that I feel the need to go back and work on my durability. Just like any other aspect of your performance or your fitness, you can work on training phases to adapt and to plan in order to improve your durability. Now, going back to Dylan's video again, there was a really good infographic where he kind of shows and demonstrates hypothetically having two riders, one having a slightly higher FTP than the other one, and what happens is, yes, okay, they might be strong early on in the ride or race, but then the one with the higher FTP, for example, might have worse durability. And so as the event goes on, they almost come down to the level of the other rider who actually tends to have quite good durability. Not because their FTP is lower per se, but they come down to a similar level or maybe even go the other way. Now this conversation on social media always comes up, like without fail, whenever I see any kind of like extreme performance or anything from, Pogacar or anybody. One of the biggest performance markers that teams look for specifically in the next good rider, the next domestique, the next Grand Tour winner, whatever, is not just what they can produce when they're fresh, because many of them are actually on a very similar level when they do a fresh effort. But then it's when they get fatigued, that's when the separation starts to happen. And it's why we see, such time gaps on the mountain stages, summit finishes, and in week 3 of Grand Tours especially. Now, the great thing about watching Dylan Johnson's channel, for example, is that the gravel races are, on the most part, really long. So when they're really long, you're often seeing lots of riders in a very fatigued state, and it really gets to a point where you'll have people just tearing each other apart. People are on their knees and they've got nothing left. And that's when it really pays to have that durability. Unbound, for example, is a prime example of having such a high intensity throughout the whole race, and then you're still having to follow potential attacks after multiple hours out there racing. Now, looking at the events I'm doing, they're not as long. The Étape de Tour, the Gran Fondo Mont Ventoux, it's not going to be as long as an Unbound, for example. But it could well be for any one of you watching. It's all relative. If you're climbing faster or if you're climbing slower, it's going to take you longer. The durability, although it means the same thing as a blanket statement, when applied to different events, it'll be different things. It'll have different meanings. So, for argument's sake, over the course of a 12-hour time trial, which is pretty mad, I know, you're looking at like how well can you resist fatigue at one pretty steady power output and effort throughout the whole 12 hours. When it comes to doing something like the Étape de Tour or the Grand Fondo Mont Ventoux, you have a pretty specific effort that you're looking for towards the end, or maybe two efforts towards the end, which are predetermined by the mountain, the terrain that you're riding on. You pretty much know what your energy demands are up until that point, and then the mountain, well, you can almost estimate what sort of effort and time, etc. you're going to need to get to the top and finish that mountain or finish the event. Now, with both of these events for myself, I know that I'm going to have to be in the ballpark of being able to produce a pretty decent amount of power for a 1 hour period. Okay, so I guess the question now is, like, how do you test durability? Just like with FTP tests, we won't get into it, but you can do a ramp test. You can do a 5-minute effort, then a 20-minute effort, or you can just do a 20-minute effort, or you can do... Now in Dylan's video, he talks about maybe doing a set amount of work, so say 2000 kilojoules of zone 2 riding, and then doing a 20-minute max effort. Now on Strava, I noticed about a week after him bringing out the video, he decided to do a durability test out on the road. But his was slightly different. He warmed up until he completed 1000 kilojoules at around zone 2, and then he did a 20-minute max effort. He got around 420 watts, which is massive, and then he set about riding until he accumulated about 3000 kilojoules total throughout the whole ride, and then did another 20-minute effort where his drop was actually really marginal. I think it was 15-20 watts, which is really low, which shows how good his durability is, which you would expect given the fact that the events that he's always targeting are going to require this sort of power production. So that's one way of doing it. I actually asked ChatGPT if it had any suggestions to see what it thought, and it recommended 3 hours of zone 2 riding with some acute fatigue build-up with 90 minutes to go in the workout. This would include 3 by 8 minutes with 3 minutes of recovery at just over FTP. You would then do a durability effort test, which is 20 minutes as hard as you can go within the last 30 minutes of the ride. So it's kind of around about the same type of thing, the same kind of ballpark. The only exception being that you would maybe include those really hard efforts beforehand. The important things to remember are, though, that you need to ride long enough, which means you need to fuel correctly. You need to get enough carbohydrate in, and you need to stay hydrated, because these things can affect the test outcome. And you definitely need to be relatively fresh and certainly motivated to do it. For an event like the Étape or even the Haute Route Alps that I'll be doing in August, I maybe actually want to include some intensity during the period where I'm trying to get through a lot of kilojoules before I do this 20-minute effort at the end, because at the end of the day, we're climbing mountains, and so you'll be accumulating the workload in a much different way to just riding zone 2. You're also going to have altitude to deal with and possibly varying temperatures as well. So I think it's important to realize that even with something like the Ventoux Grand Fondo, where I'm going to be going uphill as hard as I can for an hour, at the end of the day, when you're testing durability and you're training, you're not always necessarily trying to mimic it one for one. That would be one way to potentially overtrain and cause excess fatigue, is by actually doing a 1 hour max effort at the end of a durability test. Just because you think the Ventoux ride is going to take you an hour or even an hour and a half, whatever, just putting it out there, I would say don't feel like you have to make it a 1-to-1 replica just because that's what your event is. Like I said, stick to something that you can do time and time again. And I want to double down on what DJ says about how to effectively train it, because as he quite rightly says, there is two sides of the coin. There's repeatability, there's durability. Repeatability, more often than not, you are already training. You are already quite used to it. So that's your 4 by 8 minute effort with 8 minutes recovery, or 5 by 5 minute efforts with 5 minutes recovery, anything like that. You're already doing it with a certain work to rest ratio. Now, when it comes to durability, you might completely change that, where you'll do 2 blocks of your 30-30s in the first hour or first 2 hours of the ride, Then you'll have a big chunk of just riding along for a couple of hours, and then you'll do another set right at the end. That's something that I certainly did for years and years and years. And don't forget that I've been riding for nearly 15 years. And that's another big reason why durability is a long-term plan. Like, I'm only now and in the last couple of years seeing the benefits of riding that long and being really consistent without injury or illness or, you know, really big accidents. Touch wood. It's a big part of that. And I used to routinely jump on group rides on the weekend that weren't actually that intense at all. If anything, I was riding about 50-55% of FTP for 3 or 4 hours, and it would leave at 9 a.m. So I would get up, I would do 2 hours in the morning before that ride. I would do some intervals within that, and then I would do the group ride, and then I would do a couple of intervals on the way home after that group ride. That's a really good way of trying to really maximize and make the most of your time, especially if you've only got time on a weekend to do a long ride. Now, when I started racing about 13 years ago, I can't even remember trying to eat 100 grams of carbs per hour while I was racing. Although in the last couple of years, and we're seeing it more and more in the media now, that the nutrition protocols and the number of grams of carbs per hour that are being taken in by these high performance individuals are also directly improving the types of performances we are seeing right at the end of these races. So without a shadow of a doubt, when I did the Dragon ride a couple of years ago in just over 9 hours, I fueled with around 130 grams of carbs per hour. I wasn't just on sports nutrition, but it was also a mixture of chocolate brownies and ham sandwiches as well. But it goes to show how much things have changed. And I think there's people out there watching this video right now who probably still haven't reached the maximum amount of carbohydrate they could potentially get in during a training session. So if you're one of those people, give it a go and see what kind of effect it has on your performance at the end of a super long training session. So that's a little bit of an insight into how durability and fatigue resistance is going to correlate to my training and what I aim to do in the next coming months. Stay tuned for more videos as we pick this apart and get into the weeds when it comes to the training sessions and seeing this improve. I'll see you in the next one.